Hello again. After how I rambled in that last lecture, I'm glad that you all came back. This is going to be our second mini lecture for the autonomic nervous system, and I am going to be much more succinct in my introduction, so that is it. We'll move on. So just like we talked about our somatic reflexes when we were talking about the spinal cord in the last chapter, we are going to just quickly cover visceral reflexes. Visceral reflexes have many of the same characteristics. They are unconscious, they are automatic, and they are stereotyped. Those are things that we saw with our somatic reflexes. Those are actually characteristics of reflexes in general, so there's nothing new or surprising about what a reflex does here. Our visceral reflexes are going to be slower in response than somatic reflexes. So remember, those somatic reflexes are super fast. As soon as you step on a piece of glass, your body automatically responds instantaneously, almost by removing your foot from that potentially damaging or injuring situation. The visceral reflexes respond slower to that. So we have an example over here that is showing us adjustment of blood pressure, which is not a split-second change within the body. It's going to take a few minutes to sort of get that going. So it's still a reflex. It still happens unconsciously. It still happens automatically, and it still happens the same way every time. But the process is going to take a little bit more time. So here is our reflex arc. Again, this should look pretty familiar to you because a reflex arc is a reflex arc. It's pretty standard, regardless of where we are in the body or what different organs we're involving. The point of a reflex is going to be to keep the body safe and prevent damage from happening. So when we start a reflex arc, we are going to start with our receptor. The receptors, like we talked about before, are going to be some sort of nerve ending that detects any number of stimuli. For our visceral reflexes, those stimuli are often things like stretching, tissue damage, different aspects of blood chemistry, so like blood pH, blood oxygen concentration, blood carbon dioxide concentration, temperature, or other factors that are associated with the organs that are part of the autonomic nervous system. That information is then going to be sent down an afferent neuron. An afferent neuron is going to move into the spinal cord of the brain, so we're back into the central nervous system here, where we have an integrating center. The integrating center is going to make a decision about the response, and it is going to then send that information out an efferent neuron towards the effector. The effector is going to then carry out the decision that was made by the integrating center, and it's going to correct for or adjust to whatever the initial stimulus was. So when we look here, again, we're just going to go through this one example. There are many examples of visceral reflexes like this. But in this case, we're starting in what's called a baroreceptor. A baroreceptor is a type of receptor that is going to monitor blood pressure in particular arteries. So in this case, we have one that's associated with a branch off of the aorta, and it is going to sense an increase in blood pressure. So an increase in blood pressure can be damaging to a number of structures in the body. So that information is sent down the glossopharyngeal nerve towards the medulla oblongata. In the medulla oblongata, that information is integrated, and then the vagus nerve is going to be our efferent neuron here, and it's going to send that information back to another neuron in the heart, or the effector, which is going to change heart rate, and that is going to decrease our blood pressure. So it slows down the heart, and we decrease our blood pressure. So this is just an example, and one of the reasons we can immediately tell that this is going to be slower than our somatic reflexes is by looking at the number of synaptic interchanges we have. We have at least 4 neurons that are going on here, and so we always get that synaptic delay. Sometimes in the somatic reflexes, we end up with just 2 neurons, and so there's virtually no synaptic delay in that scenario. Now let's break down the divisions of the autonomic nervous system a little bit more specifically, because here soon we are going to talk about each of them on their own. So we do have our two divisions. So we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic and parasympathetic often innervate the same target organs. So if you go back to the first slide after the objectives from last lecture, you'll notice that we have sympathetic listed on one side and parasympathetic listed on the other side. Oftentimes, they actually work on the same organ. So we do get both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation to the heart, for example. The sympathetic innervation would cause an increase in heart rate. Parasympathetic would cause a decrease in heart rate. Many times we'll see that the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems have contrasting effects on the target organ. So like the one I just gave for the heart would be a contrasting effect. One causes the heart to speed up, the other one causes the heart to slow down. They do sometimes, however, have cooperative effects, and so we'll talk about those actually at the end of this lecture, but they do oftentimes associate with or have targets in this, or have innervation in the same target organ. Both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are active at the same time. So right now in your body you have the parasympathetic nervous system dictating more heavily some functions of the body and the sympathetic dictating other functions more heavily. The combination of the two working together is what we call autonomic tone. And so that's simply sort of the background activity of your body. It's just what's happening right now to keep you in homeostasis. If you change your situation, if you were suddenly startled, if you decided to go jog around the block, whatever it may be, that autonomic tone is going to change. What determines the autonomic tone is actually the balance between our sympathetic tone and our parasympathetic tone, right? And so again, we can sort of shift around which one's doing what or which one's having a greater influence on the body, which ultimately would affect our background activity or our autonomic tone. Excuse me. So coming back up here to our divisions of the autonomic nervous system, we can define these. So sympathetic nervous system is going to really, its job is to prepare us for physical activity. In preparing us for physical activity, it would increase things like our general alertness. So we suddenly become very aware of what's going on around us. That would be increasing our alertness. It increases our heart rate. It increases blood pressure, airflow, blood sugar, and blood flow to muscles, while at the same time reducing blood flow to the skin and the digestive system. In extreme situations, the sympathetic nervous system is called the fight or flight system. Those would be where you're essentially, your life is at risk and you have to make a decision about how to handle a situation. So that would be under extreme stress situations. We would switch into the sympathetic nervous system, but it would dictate it as fight or flight. Parasympathetic nervous system is calming, so this is your quote-unquote rest and digest nervous system, where it is just sort of keeping up the maintenance, the overall you're just hanging out and doing stuff. It does things like reduces or conserves energy, so it reduces energy expenditure so that you can hang on to additional energy. And then sort of normal body maintenance, so digestion and urine production. You have a nice gentle or sort of consistent resting heart rate, your blood pressure is good. All of those things would be more dictated by the parasympathetic nervous system than the sympathetic nervous system. So over here, I know I mentioned this in the last little mini lecture, are breakdowns of the nervous system, right? So we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and then motor, which is either somatic or autonomic. We've talked about somatic, and so now we are moving into autonomic. So here's our parasympathetic and sympathetic. As we move into the autonomic nervous system, we're going to notice that there are some differences in the general pathways than we've seen before. So if we think back to the somatic nervous system, a typical somatic pathway would involve a motor neuron that originates from either the brainstem or the spinal cord, and the axon of that neuron is going to reach the skeletal muscle. So we basically have one really long myelinated axon coming from the brain or spinal cord and going all the way to the target cell. In the autonomic nervous system, the pathway looks a little bit different. So in this particular part of the nervous system, a signal is going to have to travel across at least 2 nerve fibers before it reaches the target cell or the target organ. It is going to cross a synapse where our 2 different neurons meet within the ganglia. So remember our sort of definition of ganglia when we were looking at the spinal cord. We're going to talk about ganglia a lot in this particular lecture. The first nerve fiber is called the presynaptic neuron, and again, that's a term that we've seen before, so we should be bringing all of our pieces together. So we have a presynaptic neuron. This presynaptic neuron is going to be myelinated, and it is going to have its neurosoma in the brainstem or the spinal cord. So its actual cell body is going to be located in the brainstem or in the spinal cord. The axon is going to extend out and into the autonomic ganglion. In the ganglion, it is going to synapse with our second neuron, and it is going to secrete acetylcholine at that synapse in order to excite our second neuron. That second neuron is called our postsynaptic neuron. Its axon is going to leave the ganglion, and it is going to then extend towards the target organ. Once it gets to the target organ, this postsynaptic neuron is either going to secrete acetylcholine or norepinephrine. These axons of the postsynaptic neuron can be myelinated or unmyelinated. And sometimes they don't actually synapse with a particular cell, but they actually sort of just release their acetylcholine into release their neurotransmitter into a general area and then stimulate a whole bunch of cells. So regardless let me sort of set that again. The autonomic nervous system is going to involve both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So we can see here that we're really going to start either in the hypothalamus or in other parts of the brainstem. We do have motor neurons that are associated with the spinal cord or the peripheral ganglia, and we do come from the nerve fibers either in the cranial nerve fibers or the spinal nerve fibers. So we can look over here at the differences between these two, so between somatic and autonomic. So here's somatic. We still have our neurosoma here in the spinal cord, in the gray matter. Its axon is going to be myelinated, and it's just one long axon all the way to our target cell, where it acts sort of directly on this particular cell. The autonomic pathway starts very similarly. This is the axon of the presynaptic neuron is myelinated. Here's the synapse in that ganglia, and then here is an unmyelinated fiber that then goes to its target or effector. Taking just another quick look at our reflexes and adding one more piece to it. The autonomic reflexes are either long reflexes or short reflexes. Long reflexes are what we often talk about. So in this case, we have, here's our sensory cell and here's whatever our stimulus is. That afferent neuron is going to carry it into the central nervous system, and then the efferent is going to carry it back out. The afferent branch, the key is here that it goes all the way to the central nervous system. Some cases of autonomic reflexes, we actually don't go all the way back into the central nervous system, so everything is going to happen peripherally or in the peripheral nervous system. So in this case, we have our sensory receptor. It sends its message just into the ganglion, which is part of the peripheral nervous system, and then we come back out to the effector. So we can see this pathway is pretty similar to what we just looked at in terms of its involvement of a synapse in a ganglia. All right, and I'm not going to spend too much time reading this table to you. We're not actually going to talk about all of it necessarily. We've talked about the effectors, we talked about the control, we've talked about the efferent pathways and the neurotransmitters and the effect on target cells. A lot of these things will sort of wrap back around to at the end of this lecture, so you will probably want to come back and refer to this table a little bit later, but for now I am going to end this mini lecture and move on to the next one.